Act 1. The blade that should not exist. Somewhere in Europe, in the cold and restless centuries of the 9th century, a blade was forged that should not have existed. The world at that time was not the world we imagine from polished museum displays. It was rough, fragmented, violent. Kingdoms rose and fell quickly. Borders shifted like sand. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Technology moved slowly, or at least that is what we assume. In a small forge, perhaps in a monastery workshop, perhaps in a riverside trading town, perhaps somewhere now lost to history, iron was heated until it glowed orange, then white. Sparks burst into the dark air. Bellows roared. The hammer fell again and again, shaping something long, straight, deliberate. It did not look magical. It did not shine like something from legend. It was not decorated with gold or jewels. It was simply a sword, a Viking sword, double-edged, balanced, built for the brutal closeness of early medieval combat, a weapon designed not for ceremony, but for survival. And yet, hidden inside that ordinary shape was something extraordinary. Stamped into the blade, framed by small crosses, was a name plus ULFBERH+, not scratched into the surface afterward, not carved into cold metal, but stamped into the steel itself, pressed there while the blade was still alive with heat, while the metal was soft enough to accept identity. A signature, a declaration, a mark of confidence. For centuries, these swords were buried alongside their owners. Warriors were laid to rest with them, as if the blade was too valuable to pass into another hand. The sword was not inherited, it was taken into the grave. Over time, soil swallowed them, kingdoms disappeared, languages changed, entire cultures reshaped the map of Europe. But the blades remained. When archaeologists began uncovering them, from Scandinavia to the rivers of Eastern Europe, they noticed something unusual. The name appeared again, and again, and again. More than 170 swords have been found bearing variations of the same inscription. At first, historians believed they were simply high-quality weapons from the Viking Age, a respected maker perhaps, a skilled smith whose work was widely traded. But then modern metallurgists examined the steel, and the mystery deepened. The metal was unusually pure. The carbon content was strikingly high. The internal structure was consistent, almost shockingly so for its time. Most European swords of the early medieval period were forged using bloomery iron. Bloomery furnaces could not fully melt iron. They produced a spongy mass filled with slag, tiny impurities trapped inside the metal. Skilled smiths could work around these flaws, folding and hammering the iron to improve it. But the imperfections never disappeared entirely. The result was serviceable, strong enough, good for battle, yet uneven, brittle in places, vulnerable under extreme stress. The Ulfberht blades were different. They were smoother, more uniform, harder, yet less fragile. To produce steel of that quality requires temperatures around 1,600 degrees Celsius. Temperatures far beyond what typical European furnaces of the 9th century were believed capable of reaching. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. This was not accidental. This was not a lucky forge day. This was deliberate metallurgy, repeated, controlled, stamped with the same name. Who was Ulfberht? A single master blacksmith whose skill was unmatched. A network of workshops operating under one trusted mark. A monastery preserving advanced techniques. Or something even more intriguing. An early medieval brand, protecting its reputation in a world where steel could mean the difference between life and death. Even more fascinating, not every blade bearing the name was equal. Some were masterpieces, others were crude imitations, misspelled inscriptions, inferior metal, attempted copies, which suggests something remarkable. The name carried value. Value worth copying, value worth faking in the 9th century. The deeper researchers look into these blades, the more uncomfortable the conclusion becomes. The Viking Age was not technologically primitive. Europe was not isolated from the wider world. Trade routes were longer, connections were deeper, knowledge travelled farther than we were taught to believe. And resting quietly in museum cases today, these blades carry silent proof of that forgotten network. The story of Ulfberht is not simply the story of a sword, it is the story of trade stretching across continents, of technology moving quietly between cultures, of reputation, craftsmanship, and innovation surviving in a world we often label as dark. Because history does not move forward in a straight line. Sometimes it leaps, sometimes it forgets, and sometimes, buried beneath centuries of soil, it leaves behind something that should not exist, and waits for us to ask why. Act 2. Steel beyond its century. If the name on the blade was mysterious, the metal itself was even more unsettling. For generations, historians believed medieval European swords followed a predictable pattern. Iron was extracted from ore in small bloomery furnaces. The result was not liquid metal, but a glowing mass of semi-molten iron mixed with slag, fragments of stone and impurities trapped inside. A skilled blacksmith could improve this material by folding it, hammering it, and heating it again and again, each strike driving out more weakness. But even the best bloomery iron carried flaws. Microscopic pockets of impurity, inconsistent carbon distribution, hidden weaknesses that could turn fatal in battle. Steel, at its core, is iron mixed with carbon. Too little carbon, and the blade bends. Too much, and it shatters. The perfect sword requires balance, hardness for cutting, flexibility for survival. When modern scientists examined genuine Ulfberht blades under microscopes, they expected to see the usual medieval structure. They did not. Instead, they found steel with remarkably high carbon content, uniform, clean, with almost none of the slag inclusions common in European blades at the time. The metal was closer to later industrial era steel than to early medieval iron. To achieve this, iron must be fully liquefied before forging. That requires temperatures around 1,600 degrees Celsius. Standard European furnaces of the 9th century were not designed to reach such heat. Most bloomery furnaces operated well below that threshold. They could soften iron, but not completely melt it. And yet the Ulfberht steel shows signs of full liquefaction, a process that allows impurities to separate and rise away from the metal. Whoever created the finest of these blades had access to a method Western Europe would not widely master for centuries. This was not a small improvement, it was a technological leap. But there is another layer to the mystery. Not every Ulfberht blade is made of this superior steel. Some contain the expected slag, some show uneven carbon levels, some were clearly forged using standard bloomery methods, yet they still carry the name. This suggests something extraordinary. The inscription was not merely a craftsman's signature, it was a mark of identity, and like all marks of identity, it could be copied. Imagine the world of the 9th and 10th centuries. Trade routes stretched along rivers like arteries through the European continent. Silver from distant lands flowed north, furs and slaves travelled south, markets formed at river junctions, information moved with merchants and warriors alike. In that world, reputation mattered. A sword was not simply a tool, it was protection, status, survival. If a blade bearing the name plus ULFBERH+T had proven stronger in battle, less likely to break, sharper for longer, more reliable, word would have spread quickly. Warriors would ask for it, traders would seek it, and other smiths would attempt to imitate it. Some succeeded, others did not. The result is a collection of blades that share a name, but not always the same quality, which tells us something profound. By the Viking Age, Europe already understood branding, already understood quality control, already understood the power of a name stamped into steel. The mystery then is not simply how the steel was made, it is how knowledge moved. Because the technology required to produce this level of steel did exist, but not in Northern Europe. Far to the east, crucible steel production was already refined. There, iron could be melted completely in sealed crucibles, producing ingots of remarkably pure high-carbon steel. If such ingots travelled north along great river routes, if traders carried them across continents, if European smiths forged imported steel into blades and marked them with a trusted name, then the Ulfberht sword is not a miracle. It is evidence. Evidence that the so-called Dark Ages were connected. Evidence that technology does not belong to one culture alone. Evidence that innovation can travel thousands of kilometers quietly inside a cargo hold. The blade does not speak, but its structure does. Under magnification, under chemical analysis, under modern scrutiny, it reveals a world more advanced than we were taught to imagine. And that raises the larger question. If this level of metallurgy was possible in the 9th century, what else have we underestimated? Act 3. Rivers to the edge of the world. If the steel did not originate in Northern Europe, then it must have travelled. To understand the Ulfberht swords, we must leave the forge behind and step onto the rivers. In the Viking Age, the sea was not a boundary, it was a road. Longships cut through cold northern waters, but the true highways of trade ran inland, along vast river systems stretching deep into Eastern Europe. The Dnieper, the Volga, the Don. From Scandinavia, traders and warriors moved south through what is now Russia and Ukraine, navigating rapids, portaging their ships over land, carrying goods across distances that defy the image of an isolated medieval world. These routes did not end in forests, they ended in markets, in cities connected to the Byzantine Empire, in territories linked to the Islamic Caliphate, in trade hubs where silver, silk, spices and steel changed hands. Archaeologists have found thousands of Islamic silver coins in Scandinavian hoards. This was not rare contact, it was sustained exchange. Where silver travelled, other goods followed, and among those goods may have been crucible steel. In parts of Central Asia and the Middle East, smiths had already mastered techniques capable of producing exceptionally pure, high-carbon steel. Iron was melted completely inside sealed clay crucibles, allowing impurities to separate from the metal. The result was an ingot, dense, uniform, strong. From such ingots, superior blades could be forged. If these ingots moved westward through established trade networks, they could have reached Viking traders operating along the rivers. From there, the steel could have been forged into blades in Northern Europe, stamped with a name that carried trust. This would explain the mystery. Not secret knowledge hidden in a northern monastery, not an isolated technological miracle, but connection. The Viking world was not just raiders and longships burning coastal towns. It was merchants navigating thousands of kilometers, negotiators crossing cultural boundaries, intermediaries between distant civilizations. They were positioned perfectly between worlds, between east and west, between silver and fur, between steel and demand. The Ulfberht swords may represent the physical proof of that network, a blade shaped in the north, but born from metal that began its journey far to the east. And yet, something else makes this story even more compelling. Trade is fragile. Routes depend on political stability, on safe passage, on functioning markets. When empires fracture, when borders harden, when conflict interrupts the flow of goods, technology can disappear. If the supply of crucible steel ingots declined, if eastern trade routes were disrupted, if access to high-quality material ended, then the production of true Ulfberht blades would fade. And that is exactly what the archaeological record suggests. By the 11th century, the superior variants become rarer. Eventually, they vanish. The name remains on inferior copies for a time, but the extraordinary steel disappears, as if the river simply stopped carrying it. What we are left with is not just a sword, but a snapshot of a moment in history when continents were quietly connected, long before the modern world gave that connection a name. The blade becomes a map, a line of steel tracing rivers from Scandinavia to distant furnaces in the east. And when we hold that blade in a museum today, we are not just looking at a weapon. We are looking at evidence that the Viking Age was part of a much larger story, a story that stretched far beyond the horizon. Act 4. The name that meant power. By now, the mystery is no longer just about steel. It is about a name, ULFBERH+T, stamped into glowing metal, repeated across generations, copied, misspelled, imitated. In a world without mass production, without factories, without advertising, a name still carried weight. In the Viking Age, reputation travelled faster than ships. If a blade survived battle after battle, if it did not shatter against a shield, if it held its edge longer than others, warriors would remember, and they would speak. The name on the blade became more than a mark of authorship. It became a promise of strength, a promise of reliability, a promise that when steel met steel, this blade would endure. But here is where the story takes another turn. Not all blades bearing the inscription were equal. Some were forged from the superior high-carbon steel we examined earlier. Others were clearly not. Some inscriptions were carefully aligned and precisely stamped. Others were uneven, crude, misspelled. In some examples, the crosses were misplaced. In others, letters were reversed or altered. This suggests something remarkable. The name had value, independent of the blade itself. And where there is value, there are copies. We are not looking at a single blacksmith quietly signing his work. We may be looking at one of the earliest examples of brand identity in European history, a trusted name, recognized across regions, desired by warriors who may never have met the original maker. Imagine a marketplace along a river in Eastern Europe. Merchants unloading goods, warriors examining blades, hands running along edges, eyes searching for a familiar inscription. The difference between life and death could rest in that choice. And so, some smiths may have begun stamping the name onto inferior steel, hoping to borrow its reputation. In doing so, they unintentionally revealed something powerful. The medieval world understood quality, understood trust, understood that symbols could carry meaning beyond the material itself. The Ulfberht inscription is more than decoration. It represents confidence in craftsmanship. It represents networks of distribution. It represents the idea that certain names stand above others, even in a fragmented early medieval landscape. But branding also creates vulnerability. If the original source of superior steel depended on fragile trade routes, if access to high-quality material fluctuated, if political shifts disrupted supply, then maintaining that reputation would become difficult. The finest blades would grow rarer, copies would multiply, and over time, the meaning behind a name would fade. What began as a mark of exceptional metallurgy could dissolve into imitation, until eventually it disappeared, not in a dramatic collapse, but in quiet absence. The stamp fades from history. The superior steel vanishes from graves, and the name that once meant power becomes a puzzle for archaeologists centuries later. Act 4 forces us to confront a new idea. The Viking Age was not simply about conquest. It was about networks, reputation, economic identity, and somewhere within that world, a name stamped into steel became powerful enough to be copied, which may be the greatest proof of its importance. Act 5, the vanishing of a miracle. For a time, the Ulfberht name meant something rare. It meant a blade that could be trusted, a weapon that felt different in the hand, a sword that could survive what others could not. But then, slowly, the trail begins to fade. Not abruptly, not with a single dramatic event. Just less. Fewer finds, fewer superior blades, fewer examples of that unusually pure steel. And by the 11th century, the true Ulfberht miracle is nearly gone. The name does not vanish immediately. Inferior copies continue for a time, but the exceptional metal that made the legend real begins to disappear from the record. So what changed? The first answer is the simplest: trade. The finest Ulfberht swords likely depended on something Northern Europe could not reliably produce on its own: exceptionally pure, high-carbon steel arriving from far beyond the Viking world. If that steel came through eastern routes, along rivers that link Scandinavia to distant markets, then the Ulfberht story was tied to the stability of those routes. And stability is fragile. Empires shift, borders harden, tolls increase, war interrupts commerce. A single fortified city can redirect an entire economy. A single conflict can turn a river route into a death trap. If the flow of crucible steel ingots slowed or stopped, then the finest blades would become harder to make. The second answer may be even more unsettling: control. If Ulfberht functioned like a brand, then quality depended on control. Control over materials, over workshops, over the right to stamp the name. But as the name gained value, copying would have increased. More imitations, more misspellings, more inferior steel carrying the same mark. In that kind of environment, reputation collapses quietly. At first, buyers notice small differences. Then stories circulate, then trust erodes. Eventually, the mark becomes meaningless, and when a name becomes meaningless, it dies. There is also a third possibility, one that feels almost cruel in its simplicity. The world moved on. As Europe entered the later medieval period, sword making evolved, new styles appeared, different forging techniques spread, armies changed, armor changed, armor changed, armor changed, armor changed. The needs of war shifted. Even a legendary blade can become outdated when the battlefield changes. And yet, there is something haunting about the Ulfberht disappearance. Because if the secret was truly trade, if the miracle depended on connections across continents, then what we are witnessing is not just the end of a sword. We are witnessing the loss of a pathway of knowledge, a route that once carried not only goods, but advanced material technology. When that route failed, the knowledge did not remain in the north. It vanished with the supply. And for centuries afterward, Europe would produce countless swords, many fine, many deadly, but few that carried the same strange signature of purity. The Ulfberht story becomes a reminder that progress is not guaranteed. A civilization can reach outward, touch something advanced, and then lose it. History can advance and then forget. The graves that hold Ulfberht blades are more than burial sites. They are sealed time capsules. Proof that the medieval world could be connected, sophisticated, and technologically surprising, and proof that those connections could break. By the time later Europeans mastered higher quality steel production again, the people who once carried it into the Viking world were long gone. Only the blades remained, silent, buried, waiting to be rediscovered as evidence of a miracle that came and then slipped away. Act 6. Myth, Memory, and Misunderstanding. By now, the Ulfberht sword feels almost legendary. A blade ahead of its time. Steel that defied expectation. A name that carried weight across continents. It would be easy to turn it into myth. To imagine secret guilds guarding forbidden knowledge. To imagine lost northern technologies erased from history. To imagine a single mastersmith whose skill bordered on the supernatural. But the truth is both more grounded and more fascinating. The Ulfberht swords do not prove that medieval Europe possessed hidden futuristic technology. They prove something far more important. They prove connection. For centuries, the period between the fall of Rome and High Middle Ages was labelled the Dark Ages. A time of decline, isolation, technological stagnation, but the steel inside these blades tells a different story. It tells us that materials, ideas, and techniques were moving across enormous distances. It tells us that the Viking world was not standing still. It was participating in a larger economic system that stretched from the North Atlantic to Central Asia. And perhaps most importantly, it tells us that innovation does not belong to a single civilization. The superior steel found in genuine Ulfberht blades was not invented in Scandinavia. It was not born in isolation. It likely emerged from metallurgical traditions far to the east, traditions that had already mastered the art of melting iron completely in crucibles, creating steel of remarkable purity. When that steel entered the Viking trade network, it became something new, forged into northern blades, stamped with a northern name, buried in northern graves. The Ulfberht sword becomes a fusion, eastern metallurgy, northern craftsmanship, and continental trade woven into a single object. And yet, memory is fragile. When the trade route shifted, the material vanished. When the supply stopped, the knowledge did not fully remain. Europe would continue to innovate, of course. Sword making would evolve, armor would improve, metallurgy would advance again in time. But the specific combination that created the finest Ulfberht blades disappeared for centuries. This challenges a common assumption about progress, that history moves steadily forward. It does not. It surges, it fragments, it reconnects, it forgets. The story of Ulfberht reminds us that technological advancement can depend on delicate systems. Trade networks, political stability, access to resources, trust between distant cultures. Break one link in that chain, and entire methods can fade into obscurity. What makes this story even more compelling is that it survived only because of burial. The warriors who carried these blades into battle took them into the grave. They did not melt them down. They did not pass them along endlessly. They sealed them in earth. And that decision preserved evidence of a globalized medieval world. Without those graves, the mystery might never have been noticed. The Ulfberht sword forces us to rethink how we imagine the past. The Viking Age was not a world of isolated tribes hammering crude iron in smoky huts. It was a world of long-distance commerce, of negotiated exchange, of technological blending. It was a world where a river in Scandinavia could connect, indirectly, to furnaces thousands of kilometers away. When we look at these blades today, displayed behind museum glass, we often focus on their shape, their balance, their symmetry, their lethal elegance. But the real story lies beneath the surface, inside the metal, in microscopic structures that reveal temperature, carbon content, and manufacturing method. Modern science had to catch up before we could fully appreciate what medieval hands had achieved. That may be the most poetic part of this story. A 9th century blade waiting more than 1,000 years for 21st century technology to explain it. The Ulfberht sword is not magical, it is not alien, it is not evidence of lost super civilizations, it is something more powerful. It is proof that the medieval world was complex, proof that innovation traveled, proof that history is rarely as simple as the labels we give it. And perhaps that is the true lesson of Ulfberht, not that it was impossibly advanced, but that we underestimated the people who made it. The steel that remembered. In the end, the Ulfberht sword is not just a weapon, it is a question forged in steel. How connected was the medieval world really? How much knowledge moved quietly across rivers and deserts? How many innovations were borrowed, shared, lost, and then rediscovered centuries later? The blade stamp plus ULF. Blade, stamp plus ULFBE, does not shout its story. It waits. It waits in museum cases. It waits in soil beneath forgotten graves. It waits under microscopes, revealing secrets invisible to the naked eye. And what it reveals is not magic. It reveals people. Blacksmiths working late into the night, traders navigating dangerous river routes, warriors choosing the blade they trusted most, craftsmen protecting a name that meant something. The Ulfberht sword reminds us that history is rarely simple. The so-called Dark Ages were not dark at all. They were connected, they were experimental, they were alive with movement. Progress did not begin in the modern world, it has always existed, rising, fading, returning in new forms, and sometimes a single object survives long enough to prove it. A sword. A name. A piece of steel that remembered what we forgot. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden networks of the Viking Age, consider subscribing for more stories where history challenges what we think we know. Because the past is never as distant as it seems. Sometimes, it is only waiting to be uncovered.